大家好，我是近史所所长雷祥林。首先，我想先代表近史所热烈欢迎大家来参加今天的讲座，就是由哈佛大学的栗山茂久教授跟大家进行的讲座。那在这开始之前，我要先跟大家说一个抱歉的事，就是在此同时，近史所有一位同仁院方正在投他的升等，所以有可能会打电话进来，我需要接电话。但我预期应该不会接到电话，但是万一响起的话，我可能要到旁边去接一下电话。在这里先跟大家说明一下。那我们今天非常高兴的请到栗山茂久教授，他是 Reischauer Institute Professor of Cultural History at Harvard University。他在2005年开始就在哈佛任教，然后在那之前，他曾经在 University of New Hampshire、Emory University， 还有京都的 International Research Center for Japanese Studies。长期的任教。那另外对我来讲，他今天最重要的身份是，他是近史所最新聘任的咨询委员。那我们感到非常感谢，就是栗山茂久教授接受我们的邀请，担任近史所的咨询委员。那近史所之所以邀请栗山茂久教授担任我们的咨询委员，当然除了他的学术研究是非常卓越之外，还有一个很重要的原因，就是我想他是最早就看出台湾在国际历史学界研究的巨大潜力。那我讲的就当然是在医学史方面，从上个世纪末开始，他就参与，就是说跟史语所的一些先进同仁，还有在那个人社中心的梁启之老师们，共同在台湾推动生命医疗史的研究，然后长期的投入，还有支持台湾生命医疗史的发展。那乃至于就是说最具体的，后来成立了亚洲医学史的中心。的基地就是在史语所。我想他比谁都更早的看到台湾在历史研究上的巨大潜力，而且曾经成功的帮助我们建立了这样的一个具有国际意义的一个研究中心。那随着就是说近史所的研究扩展到东亚近代史，还有栗山茂久的教授也延伸到近代日本的科学史，我们就非常希望能够借助他的协助，让我们在近史所不只是近史所的同仁，还有所外的所有的同仁一起努力，在台湾建设一个具有国际意义的东亚现代史的研究中心。那这是我们今天特别高兴邀请到他的原因。但是呢，今天他能够在这里跟大家见面，就是说并不是我们特别把他邀请来的，这要感谢那个 Deakin Foundation for the History of Science and Technology in East Asia。那这个基金会是专门来支持东亚科学史研究的基金会。那栗山茂久教授很早就参与这个基金会的创立。那这个基金会创立于2008年，而且支持过非常多的杰出的研究者，而且特别是在19世纪后的东亚科学史的部分。那支持过的重要的研究学者有一位就是在场的洪广济教授，那个台大地理系的洪广济教授。那我们也因此呢，我们非常高兴，就这次 Deakin Foundation 在台湾开会的时候，把栗山茂久教授带来台湾。就我们知道这消息就非常高兴，然后我跟他联络的时候就知道说，他说他已经很久没有来台湾了，很想念台湾的老朋友，所以他自费多留下台湾几天，希望来见这里老朋友和新朋友。所以我们就借这个机会跟洪广济教授合作筹办了这个一系列的演讲。前一场是上个礼拜，在座有同仁可能已经参加过了。那所以在这里我也要感谢 Deakin Foundation， 还要感谢洪广济教授。还有台大历史系的吕少礼教授。那这边顺便要说的一点是说，我刚刚提到就是说史语所的先进扮演的重要角色。我们选择这场演讲的时候，就我以为栗山教授明天就要离开了，所以选了一个史语所现在正在他们有学术会议的时候，所以在场史语所的人都没办法出现。那还好，他们后来又跟栗山教授研究，明天还有一场演讲，栗山教授的演讲也是明天10点钟在史语所举办。题目叫做 "To see is to become blind: the role of images in the history of the body"。我想那也是会非常精彩的演讲。就为了表达我的歉意，我带史语所在今天做一个宣传。那再来，我们回到栗山茂久的身上，就是说，其实我知道在座以及现场非常多的朋友都很对他有非常多的了解，所以我就特别问栗山茂久教授，他希望怎么样被介绍给大家。那他给我提了2个小的 paragraph。 第一个是说他的研究兴趣是 historical epistemology， 就历史认识论。 For decades he has been pondering the theoretical question: of what it means exactly for people in different times and places to know the world differently. His book on the different conceptions of the body in ancient Greek and Chinese medicine has been translated into Chinese, Korean, Spanish, and modern Greek. 我想大家都很熟悉他这本就是《Expressiveness of the Body》或中文翻译成身体的语言的这本书。在那之后，他还有非常非常多相关的研究，那都是非常有意思的题材。所以我猜大家会觉得，近史所能够邀请到你们的咨询委员来，怎么不请他讲一个历史专门的题目呢？不讲一个跟近代史专门有关的题目，却讲一个跟 presentation 有关的题目呢？那这是今天我研究的今天介绍的最后一个部分，但是我把它留为一个 puzzle， 请大家把它放在心里，看看今天演讲听完的时候，大家是否觉得这个问题已经得到了解答？就为什么我们邀请栗山茂久教授来讲的是 presentation， 而不是具体的历史的题材？但在这里我可以提供一个线索，就是他自己把这个称为他的另外一个近年来最主要的 concern。The other interest is practical. His talk today on presentation is part of a lifelong concern with the question, how can one most effectively enable others to understand what one knows? He was a co-founder at Harvard of an annual presentation event called Harvard Horizons, in which 8 graduate students from across the university are selected and trained for 3 months to communicate their dissertation research in about 5 minutes to a larger audience of faculties, fellow students, and the general public. 就是我想大家都会感到这是一个非常大的挑战，就是你要在整个来自哈佛大学不同学院的学生，要把他的 dissertation 的研究在5分钟之内讲给所有的人听。所以我想，在大家思考我的问题的时候，就可以知道，其实这不是一个他的一个额外的兴趣，而是他投入巨大心力的一个题目。那我的介绍就到此为止，请大家一起热烈鼓掌，欢迎栗山茂久教授。
Good morning. 大家好。Okay, so I think the first thing I want to try, just as a way of, introducing what I want to do today is this. If everybody could follow with me, go like this. Put your hands out in front of you. Put your hands like this. Put your fingers together like this. Then bring your hands under and put your index finger on your chin. Yeah, just on your chin. And then go like this. Okay, some of you are okay, some of you are stuck. Probably about 2/3 are stuck. Like this, like this. Put your fingers together. Go under. Put your index finger on your chin and keep your fingers on your chin. So some of you are stuck and some of you aren't. And the difference is whether when you put your fingers on top, which finger comes on top. If you're stuck, if you move your fingers one place, then you can get unstuck. Okay. But to do that probably feels very unnatural, right? We have certain habits, certain ways of doing things that are perfectly natural to us, and we wouldn't think to do it any other way. But if you change your habit just one little bit, just displaced by one finger, then what's physically impossible becomes trivial. It's just that changing of the habit of very slightly that can make a huge difference. And I think this is really important for thinking even about presentation, right? That some of you may be interested in presentation, some of you may not, but some of you may think, oh, creating big presentations is too much, it's too difficult or too complex. But I think a lot of it is just a little bit shift in ways of thinking, right? That's the main sort of broad lesson. So my question today is, of course, how can we give more engaging and memorable presentations? I have to say I regret it a little bit giving this title because 就是压力很大, right? Because this presentation itself then has to be memorable and engaging, otherwise 很糟糕, right? But I'll try my best. But what I want to do today is basically mainly focus on giving some very practical, useful tips. Give a series of tips. Some of them you might find useful, others may be less useful. But even if you find one or two that are useful, I think hopefully that will make your morning worthwhile, right? And most of them are pretty simple to do. You just have to, think about them. But I'm not just going to talk about these practical tips. I also want to make a broad theoretical point. And the theoretical point is basically that in order to give more engaging and memorable presentations, we have to rethink what a presentation is, right? And basically my argument is the way we think, that is, you hear my colleagues at Harvard, the vast majority of the way most people think about presentations, I think is probably wrong. And I hope we discuss whether you may disagree with me, and that would be fine. So I'm suggesting we want to reimagine. And what is the way in which we must reimagine? So I think there's a habitual way in which we think about presentations, and I want to suggest this fresh, new way. So another benefit of coming today is that you learn a very obscure word that most of my colleagues at Harvard don't even know. It's this word opsimath. And what it means, so you can impress your friends and confuse your enemies. Opsimath means learning late in life, someone who learns late in life. So opsimathy is something to learn late in life. Sometimes it's applied to adult education. But I really love this word because I find that I'm always learning late in life, and that I'm learning things that I think, I should have learned this years ago. How come I only learned, I'm past 60, almost 70. How come I only learn now? I think I'm bunt, right? But one of these things is really this idea about presentation. For a long time, for decades, I thought in this way. And it's only fairly recently that I've developed this other way of thinking about it. So what is that difference? So I think my metaphor for the way in which most of us think about presentations is what I call the moving van model. The moving van model. I don't know if you have Kuronake Yamato in Taiwan, but very popular moving company in Japan. So what is the moving van model? Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. The moving van model is basically you are the presenter, you decide, you're going to a conference, you have certain ideas, you have certain information, you have certain ideas. And what is the presentation? The presentation is a vehicle, right, to take your ideas from your brain into the brain of your listeners. Right? That's basically how I think most of us habitually think about presentation, right? That you're giving a presentation to take what's in your mind into somebody else's mind. So it's basically this idea of communication as transfer, right? Sometimes communication theorists will also talk about the conduit metaphor. It's not just presentations, but writing, that whether it's an article or a book or a presentation, it's a conduit or a tube that connects your mind to somebody else's mind, right? Sorry, I'm going to tie my shoe. So I think it's a very common way, even we probably don't necessarily explicitly think about what communication is about, but I think this is the model that we implicitly at least assume. But as I say, I think this is the wrong model, right? And the fact that we have this model is one of the reasons why, at least I think, that most presentations are not so memorable and engaging, right? So what is, I think there's an alternative way to imagine presentations. And as you can tell from my title, it's basically like this, that we can think about presenting like herding cats, right? So here's a cat herder, and the audience is like cats. You're all like cats, and I'm the cat herder. So why is this alternative, why do I think this alternative is better? And what does it mean? The basic problem, I think, with the model, the moving model of moving van model presentation is its very obvious and fundamental flaw that somehow, despite its obviousness, is almost always ignored. And that is that your audience, your listeners are never passive receptacles, right? They're not empty storehouses in which you can dump your ideas and thoughts, right? You certainly aren't. Like, as soon as I say something, you start thinking, right? You may agree, you may disagree, right? You may wonder about what I'm talking about. You're constantly thinking, right? You're active agents. And that, I think, is fundamental in thinking about communication, right? You have to assume that your audience is actively thinking, right? So you can't just think about presentation as just giving out ideas. So, you know, especially in the beginning of a talk, people seem very attentive. They look like this, right? And, you know, you're a pretty polite audience, I think. And you may continue to look like that, but inside your mind, right, you may be more like this, right? That as soon as people start talking and show a slide or say a few words, then they start associating, and people may start thinking about different things, right? And I think this is the basic situation that we all face whenever we give a talk at, or even give lectures to our students, give talks at our conference, right? That everybody has their own mind, they're actively thinking, and maybe they say, oh, this is not so interesting, I'm going to think about something else, or I'm going to, you know, tweet my friends. So I think that makes communication very difficult, right? To make effective presentation very difficult. It's not about transferring what you want to say, it's about guiding, right, the cats. So listeners are not empty storehouses. Listeners are active agents. So this is, I think this is true, and I think this is the starting point from which we have to think about everything else, right? So what does it mean to communicate then with active agents? If it's not a question of just taking what things in your mind and transferring them or transplanting them into other minds, what does it mean to communicate? It just doesn't make sense once you think about listeners as active agents. It doesn't make sense to think about, oh, I have certain ideas, I'm just going to tell them and people will sort of transcribe them in their own minds. I think the better way, and really thinking about, a better metaphor is, instead of thinking about transferring particular information, thinking about guiding or herding the listeners to a new place. that what understanding involves is standing somewhere else, something you're able to see something because you've moved to a new place and you're able to see things from a new perspective, right? So basically, the listeners have to move themselves, right? You can't, it's not just a question, you giving them information, you're helping them to move to a different place so that they can understand something new. I think that's the goal, right? And so the whole problem is how do you get people to move in that same direction? And basically that's what I want to suggest, really some basic tips to accomplish. So how exactly do we do this? How do we herd cats? So I'm going to give a series of practical tips, and then at the very end, I'm going to return to some theoretical points. And the practical tips I'm going to divide into several levels. Each level is slightly more demanding and complex. This first level of tips, I think, should be accessible to everybody. If you just think about it. It's very elementary, as you'll see, but I think if you do it, then your presentations will be better than 90% of presentations that are currently being done. And this has to do with slides. That is, if you use PowerPoint or, Keynote, presentational software. It's all very elementary, but I'm going to give 4 suggestions at this level, but they all have to do with one basic principle, and that is don't distract, right? Don't distract. I think one of the basic problems is we're constantly distracting our listeners. We're making it worse, right? Without knowing it, we distract our listeners so they don't know where they're going. And you'll understand this in just right away. So, first of all, the first tip is if you're showing any images in your presentation, basically try, and all of these are general rules, right? Of course, there can be particular exceptions for particular reasons. But in general, if you're going to show a picture, just show one picture on one slide and make it as big as possible, right? This big size thing, I think, is quite important. So you often see somebody presenting something like this, which is okay, right? But why do you make it smaller when you can make it bigger? Now, we're in a room with a very nice screen, and it's not such a huge room. But sometimes you don't know what kind of room you're going to be in, what kind of projector you'll have. And so you want to make sure that people can actually see the image that you want people to see, right? Very basic, but I see so many people ignore this, and then people say, well, if you could actually see the image, then you would see something interesting. You want to basically make it as big as possible, right? Just so that people can focus, they see it. It's very clear, right? Very elementary, but I think quite important. A subtler point, but probably an even more common mistake is to put more than one image on a slide. Now, sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes you're making a comparison, and then, of course, that's fine. But if you're not making a specific comparison, then putting 2 pictures on the same slide is distracting, right? Because if as soon as you say, okay, there's a building, there's a figure, what is the relationship, and you're starting to think about this, and that may not be the point that the speaker wants to give, right? So essentially, the problem with this, whenever you put 2 things on a slide, right, is the listener doesn't know which one to focus on, right? Why distract them unnecessarily, right? Unless you want them to focus on 2 at the same time, just put 1 at a time, right? It's very elementary, but again, people ignore this all the time. The second tip is I emphasize this with ruthlessly, without pity. cut out all forgettable detail. I think, you know, as East Asian people of East Asia, we feel like, oh, we should be polite. We should be 好客, right? We should share our information. But actually, a lot of giving out more information is actually unhelpful often, right? So I'll give you a very simple example. I don't know, actually, sorry, I didn't plan on this. I don't know if you can see this. Everybody can see the bottom here? Oh, okay. So let me actually. So this is a good. I'll just put it here for now. So this is a photograph taken by a photographer named Yoneda Tomoko, right? Now, it may be important in certain circumstances to credit the photographer, and that's fine, right? But often, it's just there, right? And then, as soon as you read it, you say, okay, Yoneda Tomoko, do I know her, right? Should I know her? Who is she, right? And that may have nothing to do with the point that you want to make with this photograph, right? Again, it's a form of distraction. So this is why I say, you know, whatever you put, right, you want to make sure, absolutely sure that this is going to help the listener move in the direction that you want them to go, and to cut out everything else, right? So that the focus is very, very, very sharp. The third, and probably the single most important, because you're going to use text a lot, is to use short text that's graspable at a glance, right? And you can see from all my text that the line is relatively short, right? I think you should never make people what I would call read text. That is, spend time reading it. It should be something that can be relative, you know, taken in at a glance and immediately absorbed. I think this kind of text is extremely useful, right? But if I show you this and say, oh, as you can see, right, what marks, people will say this. I'm sure you've encountered this, where people show lots of text and as if you could read this. So of course you can't read this, right? It's too much to absorb. First of all, so you can't read the text, but then you're also trying to read it and then listen. And again, you're distracted, right? So, and of course, this is an extreme case, but again, you don't want to be competing between reading and listening, right? You want actually what people see on the screen to help them understand what you're speaking about. Those two to match together. So often they can be the same thing. That can be perfectly fine, right? Because, you know, sometimes, I'm sure you've had this experience in Taiwan. I know I had many times in Japan where, say, a professor from Harvard comes and, you know, they're very eloquent, right? But half the audience can't really understand half of what they're saying because although their reading English may be good, their listening comprehension just can't keep up, right? But if there's text to help, then it's like, oh, my English is so good, right? I mean, I feel this about German. My German is not so great, but when there's subtitles, oh, my German is actually not 很不错, right? So basically, I think using text is very helpful as like as a subtitle, right? So a corollary to this is that I think it's really good. My general policy is to have lots of slides with short text, right? Because then each text you can absorb immediately, it helps you understand. Instead of having a lot of text on one slide, then you just get tired, right? The fourth is another very elementary thing that I see so many people ignore, but I think it's a silly oversight. And that is to show only as you tell. And what I mean by this is this. So suppose I show you this, right? What happens if I show you the slide? You start to read it, right? And then you're not necessarily listening you're sort of half listening to me, but then you're also reading it, right? But I may still be on this point. You're already reading number 4, right? You're already distracted. So basically, what I mean by show only as you tell is, you show this, I'm going to talk about basic tips for slides. And the first principle I want to talk about is use large pictures, right? And then you might talk about that. And then the second principle I want to talk about is cut unnecessary detail. This is the idea. So each point, when you talk about it, you introduce, you show, right? You don't get people to read in advance of what you're saying. As you can see, this is very elementary, very basic, very easy to do, but it really will help people sort of follow effortlessly and without sort of getting distracted. Okay, so the first level is don't distract. This is sort of almost like a negative principle. There's a positive level, which is how do you actively guide attention so that people know exactly what to focus on? And I have a couple of ways to do this that are, again, pretty simple, and probably most of you have the technological wherewithal to do this. One is what I call verbal cues. And this might seem like this might seem too controlling, but I think it's actually very helpful. So what I mean by verbal cues is you're basically telling people what to think, right? And so, for example, let's say you talk about something and you've raised a question, right, a problem. Often I'll put a slide that says exactly this: why is this, right? And then everybody knows, okay, this is what I have to think about. Why is this? And then people think, why is this, right? If instead of just saying it, right, if you put it on the text, then people will actually think about this, right? Or just giving another example, it was curious, right? And say, oh yeah, it's sort of curious, and then you're thinking about that, right? So you're basically helping people to follow exactly step by step. They're never lost, right? They know exactly where they are. Second, visual cues. This is probably a little more common. Sometimes, of course, I said, of course, you just usually have short text, but sometimes, for example, you're analyzing a poem and you want a longer thing, right? I think people often will use, let's see, do I have a pointer on this? Let's see, I think this is, yes. So people do things like this, and sometimes you probably can't even see it, right? Pointing, I think, pointers are totally useless as far as I'm concerned. What you want to do is basically something like this. So there are various ways to do it, but you're sort of highlighting, right, specific text. And people can't help but focus on what it is that you want them to see. So let's say I want to contrast the human position with dogs and their doggy life, right? You're basically forcing them to look at what you want them to look at, right? Instead of just gesturing and say vaguely with your hand or with a pointer. You can do a similar thing, and if, my talk isn't that long, so if you're interested in specific techniques, how to do some of these things, I'm happy to talk about them. But you can do similar things with pictures. So generally, pictures are really complicated, and if you have the chance to come to my talk tomorrow, I'll give you, there'll be a much more elaborate demonstrations of how to analyze pictures. But I show you a picture, you have a vague idea, it's an interesting picture, but you don't know where to look at, right? It's so confusing, there's so much to look at. But let's suppose that I want you to actually focus on this portrait over there. You can highlight that portion, or I can just shift the highlight to another portion, right? So you can basically direct where people are paying attention and make sure everybody's paying attention to what you want them to pay attention to, right? It's basic, but I think it's really important. Okay, so this is getting a little more abstract and theoretical, but I think it's also the most interesting part. So level 3, the principle of less is more is, I think, the golden rule. And less is more is you put less on the slide, and that produces a better, greater result. Less is more is important for 2 reasons. One is that it maximizes focus. So remember that if you put a lot of text, then people are just sort of lost, right? If you put just a few words, then people know exactly what to focus on, and they absorb it. So it maximizes focus. That is, it minimizes distraction, right? People aren't distracted trying to think about things. They know exactly what to focus on. But there's actually an even more interesting part to less is more. And that is, it leverages something that it takes advantage of something called closure, right? And this principle of closure, I think, is really the most interesting and powerful concepts in communication. Closure, sorry, I got this backwards. Closure is, what I mean by closure is the natural tendency of our minds to fill in what we don't see, right? And I'll explain this. I got this notion originally from a person named Scott McCloud, who's an artist, a comic artist, and who wrote a book called Understanding Comics in 1994. If you haven't read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, then you must read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. I think it's really one of the most brilliant books ever written. And Scott McCloud talks about closure by giving this kind of example, where he says, this phenomenon of observing the parts but perceiving the whole has a name. It's called closure. So why is this closure? Because he's actually only drawn part of the face, right? But we assume that the reason that we're not seeing the rest of the face is that there's a wall or something, right? We can't help but assume that there's a whole face there, right? Even though it could be he's a person with half a face, right? We never think that, right? We immediately fill in the rest, right? But what that means is that we, the perceiver, reader, are engaged in creating the whole reality, right? And that's, I think, really the most powerful aspect of engagement. How do you get readers to fill in all the information that you're not providing? Another example he gives, I didn't want to go back. Another example he gives is this Pepsi bottle, right? We take one glance, right? We immediately say, oh, Pepsi bottle. But if you look closely, you'll see that you never see the whole bottle. You're just seeing a fragment, right? But we immediately say, oh, Pepsi bottle, right? If we can get our listeners to do that with our research, right? They see a part, but then they see much more. Then it's incredibly powerful, right? It's not just a little detail you provided. They're filling in much more, right? And that's, I think, the ideal, is you want them to fill in all the things that that you're not presenting. Another example, I think, and this I think is one of the most interesting insights in understanding comics, where he defines comics. Oh, sorry. Can you? I didn't anticipate this aspect. Sorry, let me move this up. It's going to look a little awkward, but. Scott McCloud defines comics, the art of comics, as the art of the gutter, right? The art of the gutter. And what he means by the gutter is this space between frames, this empty space between frames, right? Why is comics the art of the gutter? Because something is happening in scene A, something is happening in scene B, but it's the reader's imagination that fills in the connection, right, between A and B. And if the artist, this comic artist is a skilled artist, then the reader fills in naturally. They don't even think about how they're filling in, right? But they make that connection. If they're not skilled and the connection is too close, then it's boring, right? If it's too far, then it's confusing, right? And so that's what he means by the art of the gutter. But the point is that because the reader is constantly filling in, the reader is engaged and participating in the creation of that reality, right? And I think that's the ideal we should all strive for, right? Because no matter how much, how much time you have to give a presentation, whether it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or even 50 minutes, you can't give all the information that you've spent years or months accumulating. And even if you did, they would just never be able to absorb it, right? You have to depend on the reader or the listener to fill in things that you can't talk about. And so the whole art of it, and I think this is what makes presentation so much fun, right, is figuring out what are the hints that will allow people to make connections that you haven't talked about, right? It's like magic, right? It's like magic. So just that this is not from Scott McCloud, but just my example. If we have a picture of this picture, right? Man is rushing. But once we have another picture, then the meaning of it changes, right? We think, oh, maybe he's late for an appointment, right? And we immediately figure this out. Nobody has to tell us, right? If we change this picture just slightly, to this, right? Then we may think, oh, maybe he overslept, right? The alarm clock didn't go, so that's why he has to rush, right? The tiny details, this is just an example of how we're constantly filling in, right? If on a slide, right, an opening slide or somewhere in your presentation, you put this date, like April 4th, 1853. What happens in your mind? I think what happens is you think, what happened on April 4th, 1853, right? Something important must have happened. I want you to tell me about it, right? It's almost like the beginning of a novel, even though it's just a date, right? So the less you say, the more impact it has on the imagination of the listener, right? It's like, you've probably all been to, like temples where there's a pond, and if you throw a little pebble, it makes all these waves, right? The smaller the pebble, it just sort of expands outward. Let's see. So the broad point is that closure is a form of intense engagement. This is really a very powerful form of engagement that is neglected. The less you say, the more people fill in. And figuring out what are the key things that you need to say in order to allow people to fill in the direction that you want them to go is really, I think, the key. Okay, so we're nearing the end, but I want you to take a slight break. We're going to sing. Okay, I'm sorry, I really have a bad voice, but it won't matter because you're going to help me. So I'm going to go ba, ba, oh, come on, ba, 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 ba. So that third we didn't do, right? But already you're filling in your imaginations, right? That's closure, right? You're filling in things that you haven't encountered. Let's do just one more of this. So ba 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 ba. So you can see the mind is constantly working, and you're trying to leverage that activity of the listener. Okay, so let me conclude with just the goals of presentation. I've talked about techniques and the goals, and this is, I'll freely admit, this is really sort of my personal vision, and it may not be yours, but I thought I'd share how I think about it. So I suggested that the art of presentation, sorry, I somehow forgot that, is the art of herding cats, right? This is some basic metaphor that I presented. But for many years, I had a different definition, which is sort of complementary, but a little bit different. And that is that the way to think about a presentation is that it's a present, right? It's sort of a pun, but I think it's also true, right? I think one of the problems which makes so many presentations so dull is that the speaker's only interested in talking about himself or herself. Whereas I think the key is to think about the presentation is for your listeners, right? It's to help them to enrich their lives, right? I think this is a really key way to think about presentation, that a presentation is a present. It's a kind of gift. So the nature of the gift, as I see it, is to reveal what's extraordinary in things that people think ordinary. So, if you're a historian, you think all these things are really interesting. To many people, they're just facts, right? Just information. So they say, so what? Who cares, right? But if you present well or you write well, then people, oh, this is very interesting, right? It's meaningful. There's something special there that you didn't realize, right? For the listeners didn't realize before. I think this connection between the extraordinary and the ordinary is very important. That's what a good presentation does, is it makes you aware of something that you didn't realize before, and it enriches your life. In fact, I think this is, going to expand. I think this is the aim of historians and humanists, is to enrich people's lives. Right? It's not, discovering something scientific truth. It's about enriching life. Anyway, so just give some examples. So does everybody know what this is? I'm sure you have this in Taiwan, right? These are food samples, right? So again, if you go to a certain level of restaurant, you'll see these kinds of food samples. But probably most people never thought of the connection between anatomical models, right? But these food models were made in early 20th century Japan by the wax people who are trained in making wax anatomical models, right? So when Western food came in, they had to figure out how to present Western food to people who didn't know Western food. And it was the people who were creating wax anatomical, trained in anatomy labs to create models that were hired or employed to create these food models. So it's a connection between the history of medicine and the history of food. Here's a very different example. So I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm going to take you to another part of the world. So traveling really, really far. This is a place that, in some 30 years of teaching, I haven't encountered as undergraduate or even graduate student who knew this place. Really, really far to a really, really tiny, teeny island on the other side of the earth. and it's a place called the island of Run. And it's only about 3 kilometers long, 1 kilometer wide. Who knows this place? Somebody may. You are. Okay. So the reason this island was important is that it's one of the few places in the world where you could get this spice called nutmeg. Right? And nutmeg once was very precious, right? So in 1667, the British and the Dutch make a trade. And this tiny island that nobody knows about now was traded for another island. Does anybody guess what that island is? Singapore? That's an interesting guess. It's actually New York, Manhattan. Right? So this tiny island that nobody knows about was traded for this island, which is still one of the world's centers. Right? Again, it's a juxtaposition. Just a final example of a kind of interesting detail. You may have heard, probably most of you haven't read, I personally haven't read the whole thing, the novel Moby Dick. It's a very thick American novel. It has 214,000 words total. The number of unique words is about 16,000, right? Still a fair amount of words. But if you just take the 25 most common words in Moby Dick, right? The question is, that is, the 25 words is just 0.1% of 16,000, whatever, 872 words. What percentage of the words in Moby Dick do you think you'll recognize? And the answer is, well, how many times do these 25 words appear in the novel? And the answer is this, that if you know just 25 words, you'll recognize 1/3 of the words in Moby Dick, right? And I think this is actually a very telling detail about lots of life, that, you know, in order to master any discipline, you have to know endless amounts of stuff. But if you know just a tiny bit, actually you know already quite a bit, right? And I think this is also true for presentation, that the presentation is endlessly complicated and interesting. But if you know just a few things, you'll actually be, you know, far ahead of the game. Okay. Here's, I think, my best example of what I think of as my object in when I, you know, lecture in class or at academic meetings. And it goes something like this. So the idea that all perception is framed is, of course, you know, something that we all teach in, you know, in the humanities. Here's my friend Sam the sheep. He's been framed, so he's complaining. And let's see if you can hear. Can you hear? So what is he saying? Well, you don't understand sheep, but you can hear him say ba 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 ba, right? Sorry. Can we turn up the volume on this? I don't know. Maybe not. Okay. So I want you to listen carefully, because this, I think, is the kind of thing that, an example of the kind of thing that is my ideal. So if we let Sam escape his frame, when you hear the person actually saying it, you probably don't hear ba ba anymore, right? you hear a different sound. You're listening to the same sound, right? But because you're getting different inputs, your experience has become something different. And so I think this is a really good example of sort of the ideal, that you're experiencing the same reality, but somehow the reality has changed. And you realize that what you had experienced before wasn't necessarily the only way to experience the reality. Another way to put this is has to do with the history of riddles. So there's a term called neck riddles. It's a term of folklore, and the idea of neck riddles, everybody knows, I think, right? Riddles are me, right? Neck riddles means that the riddle, your life depends on solving the riddle. That's why it's called neck riddle. Like the riddle of the Sphinx, right? If you solve the riddle, then you can pass, but if you don't solve the riddle, then the Sphinx will kill you, right? That's why it's called the neck riddle. And we encounter this kind of thing all the time in traditional stories. The idea is, solve this riddle, the princess says, solve this riddle and you can marry me and become king, right? But if you fail, right, then it's off with your head. And this was a very common format for thinking about traditional riddles. Now riddles are made children's play, right? But once upon a time, there were riddling competitions. Riddles were much more serious. How do we think about this? Well, one of the, I think, interesting things about riddles is usually they have to do with wordplay, right? How do you think about, what has 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet in the afternoon, and 3 feet in the evening, right? This idea of human beings. The reason that's a riddle is because we have a certain way of looking at things, and we forget about the alternative possibilities, right? The whole point of riddles is to make you think about reality in a new way again. It's to bring back things that have become dead because you've just become habituated to them, right? So I think this is the function of riddles, is to think about rejuvenation. That's why you have neck riddles, right? That you're literally dead if you've just going through life based on the assumptions that you've always had, right? And I think this is the way to think about, another way to think about presentations is you're helping people to become alive again, right? Which is a great thing. Okay, so a final element I just want to conclude with is that a presentation is a present, but there's one other thing that I want to add, which is a presentation is a present in the present, right? This is why I think you should never read presentations. I think it's crazy for people to stand in front of an audience and then read a manuscript. Because inevitably, I think, I would understand you much better if I read it myself, right? Just at my own time, right? We're here together, present together. I want the presentation to be something that's here and now, right? Last week, I gave a talk at Taida, and I mentioned this phrase, which, does everybody know this phrase? Ichigo ichie, ichi ihui, right? I think it's common in Taiwan as well, right? And it comes from the tea ceremony, and the idea that, we're together in the tea ceremony, and the person who's organizing it is responsible for making sure that this is a special occasion, maybe the only time, right, that we're together. And so to treat it as a special occasion, I think that spirit is also very important for presentations, because in fact, it may well be the only time that you speak with a particular audience, right? And you want that occasion to be special. So to commemorate this, nowadays we usually take photographs, but I have something else here. So these are playing cards. So maybe cards in your hand and mix them up. Okay, just mix them up, and then maybe you could put your two together, and then one of you can mix them up. Like this, mix them up. Mix them up. That's I have all. Oh, thank you. So, collected them. Going to put them here. Sorry. Thank you. So what have we done? I mean, this may seem totally silly to you. You know, it's a version of something that you probably all do if you play card games, right? We shuffle, but we've done it collectively, right? Probably you play card games, you've done this, you know, dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times. But here's what's extraordinary about what just happened, right? There are 52 cards in a deck of cards, right? There are 4 suits, 8 through kings, so 13. So 4 times 13 is 52. The number of ways in which that deck of cards can be organized is sorry, let's see. Let me draw this big. So I don't know if you can see 52 factorial, right? Sorry, 52. That is sorry. 52 times 51 times 50, all the way down to 3 times 2 times 1. Right? That's the number of possible ways of ordering a deck of cards. Right? How big is this number? This number is about 8 times 10 to the 67th power. 8 times 10 to the 67th power. That's a very large number. And to show you how large that is, the number of seconds since the Big Bang, since the beginning of the universe, right, is 4.7 times 10 to the 17 seconds. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that basically every time you shuffle a deck of cards, right, you're almost certain to create something, an order that's never existed in the entire history of the cosmos. Right? So what you've just done together is created a cosmic event. It's something that's never existed in that box. It's something that's never existed in the whole history of the universe. Let me just conclude with one final example. And this is something that you can do at home. I just have a piece of paper. I just cut ordinary sheet of paper. And the first part of this if you remember your elementary school days, it's probably something you did in elementary school. If you have young children, they've probably done something like this. You start taping things, okay, and just making a cross. Very ordinary. Then what I'm going to do is make a ring. So with comics, we went back to junior high school, and now we're going back to elementary school. So I've just put two loops together, right? Very ordinary thing. But the question is, what if you have the idea, often like in elementary school, you make chains of these kinds of things, right, with colored paper. What if instead of making a chain, you start cutting? What's going to happen if you cut along the middle of this thing? Any guesses? What am I going to end up with? 4 rings. Any other guesses? What would your guess be? Again, this is another illustration of how I think about what an ideal presentation often is. That's the elements are very simple, but the results are a little bit unexpected. So you basically end up with a square. You should try this at home, but I'm going to do. But this is sort of like, I don't know, the college undergraduate version of that. But we're at the 近史所, we're at the most advanced institute. So I'm going to try a little bit something more imaginative. And again, I urge you to try this at home, and then once you try it at home, you can try it with your students. Right? Instead of just going like this, what I'm going to do is give it a one twist, and put like this. I'm going to do the same thing, but do it the other way. So what is your prediction about what I'm going to end up with? So, again, it's just 2 ordinary sheets of paper, strips of paper. We've just given them a slight twist. Any predictions? If you can guess this, I'll put, I don't know. 2000 Taipei, right? Okay, whatever. This is a very interesting thing, and I encourage you to try this at home. So I'm going to cut it. What do you think I'll get? Big circle, okay. It's an interesting possibility. So we recovered the circle that was lost. Any other ideas? So again, a sample, you're just giving a little bit of a twist. I hope this works. I did it right. But this is to commemorate. If I were a poet of an earlier, a literati of an earlier age, I would write a poem. But since I can't write a poem, I'm making this. What do I have here? You basically end up, oh, sorry, I think I made a mistake, but you end up with 2 hearts. Yeah, I think I did make a mistake. I think what I did was I twisted in the same direction. You have to twist one direction, twist the other direction. And if you do, you'll get 2 interlinked hearts. You should try this at home. Okay, I think that's it. I'm happy to take questions and discuss.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to Professor Kuriyama for giving us this great gift. Make us realizing we are having a cosmic event taking place in this conference room. And I very much enjoy it, but I think your lesson don't work for me. You will make me too nervous to cut papers in front of 500 people. And I think that right now, I think Professor Kuriyama has been talked more than 1 hour. I think right now we need a gutter. So I will take a 5 minutes break for the cats to talk to each other and come back to give us a closure. And I think that's one last thing. I guess many cats in this room feel anxious because so many things they want to observe. But I have a good news for you. The talk is recorded, so you can watch. You can watch again. This is definitely a very memorable and engaging talk, and every cat wants to watch it again. And feel free to come back to check our website. Okay, let's take a 5 minutes break, and before 5 minutes break, let's come back at 11:18. 我想我们大家可以简短的介绍一下自己，中文、英文都可以，好不好？对。
Yeah, oh, great. I have a very practical question, Professor Kuriyama, and like I was just asking how to make highlights of things within the PowerPoint highlighting text, as well as emphasizing things within the picture. What I've been doing now, if having a picture, is just drawing a circle around it, and then again, just making it appear. But I don't know if you have other suggestions about how to emphasize various things textually as well as within the images.
克里教授，你要不要介绍自己一下，简短一句？对。
Yeah. McCabe Kelleher, I'm Associate Professor of History at Southern Methodist University, but I'm a visiting scholar here for the year at the 近史所.
So there, with virtually, I'm going to stick and use the computer, but with virtually any effect, there are several ways to do it. But I'm just going to show you. I use Keynote on the Mac. If you're a Mac user, I would definitely urge you to use Keynote rather than PowerPoint. But you can do basically the same thing on PowerPoint on a PC. So I just show you what I did with this. It's very elementary. So this is the original slide. I'm just making a copy of the slide, make a second slide. Change the color of this second slide a little bit so it's light gray. Sorry. Light gray, so it becomes white. And then let's say if it's here, I just like that and change the color there to red. Right? So if I then go add a transition from the first slide to the second slide, well, I already have a transition to gold, then it goes like that, right? It's very basic. The pictures are actually the more interesting one. So let me just see if I can start this with a new slide. So to clarify, so you have two slides. First show one slide and then switch to the next slide. Yeah, that's the easiest way. I think the easiest way to do in PowerPoint. You can do it otherwise on one slide, but I think this is probably, the effect is exactly the same. The audience can't tell the difference. So that's what I would recommend. Sorry, let's see. Well, there might have. So let me just get rid of any. Sorry. Okay. So let's get rid of this for now. So I have a picture here. I'm just going to make a duplicate of that slide. So I have a second, so I'm on my second slide. And I think in PowerPoint, the way you do it is slightly different, but the basic principle is the same. So here, let's say I just go to my shapes, pick the shape menu, and in this case, I took the shape of, basically adjust the shape to this particular part of the picture. If I click on both that shape and the background picture, then all I have to do is hit mask. And I've cut out that part of the picture. Right? Then all I need to do is copy that, paste it back on to that image. So this picture is now double layered. There's a layer on top of here, right? And then all I need to do is animate this background to change its opacity. And you could do this over 2 slides. I'm just doing it on 1 slide. Change its opacity to, say, 30% over, say, a course of 2 seconds. Right now, my background is white. So, my background is white. So it's the fact is, for this, if I were doing this normally, what I would do is, change the background of this to black so that the contrast shows up a bit better. And then you have that part highlighted, right? And then you can do this with other parts, sort of make one part dissolve and another part. So you can shift the highlights around the slide. Is that clear enough, the basic idea anyway? This is a technique I really would recommend everybody use because it's really useful. Yeah. Any other?
其他的问题吗？好，这位，你请简单介绍一下。
Thank you for your amazingly useful talk, Professor Kliang. My name is Juwen Xue. I'm a PhD student from University of North Carolina at Chapel, and now I'm a PhD candidate fellow at the Institute of Ethnology. My two practical questions are about the first one. You mentioned the slide about the Yoneda Tomoko-san. So if you delete that sentence, then how can we, respect the copyright?
Right.
Yeah.
We have these habits that have. Let me give you a general remark first. I've been in academics, or I became, professor in '87, so now 35 years, I guess. I'm always struck by how professors are just like everybody else. They're creatures of habit, and we do things because they've always been done that way, and we don't think to do it. So with respect to the, for example, this issue of like credits, right? But I think another issue that I think is worth mentioning is, for example, references, right? That we might want to share. I think the simplest thing and the most useful thing for people is actually give out handouts. A handout of a sheet, right? Just a paper. It's not so common, but in fact, it's very simple and it's very useful, right? So that's what I would do for the credits.
My second question is about you say that we shouldn't read our presentation, right? Because the presentation is in the present. But if we need to present in our second language or even the third language, then it's almost impossible like prepare for these kind of talks without read it. So if any suggestions?
I totally understand, but the way I put together slides is that virtually everything I have to say is on the slide, right? So I never forget because I just rely on the slide. And often the same words I want to say are already on the slide. I'm just using, but that also means that the good thing about that is it forces you to write in a way that you speak, right? So, the way people write articles is very different than the way people normally speak, right? And so the written speech may be more eloquent, but it's often harder to follow when you hear it, right? But if you're going to put a lot of the text on the screen, then you want it pretty much like speech, right? Something that's relatively short and compact. And I think I'm very conscious of international context just because of my experience in Japan. And but even you go to Europe, and not everybody really. The official language may be English, but everybody's English is different levels, right? And having that text on the screen really helps, I think, makes it easier for everybody to understand. It also helps for the speaker, like some people may have a stronger accent, right? And so you may not be able to hear it orally, but if you can see it, then it's very clear.
Thank you.
One reason that I think it's really important not to read is this, that if you can't remember, right, what you want to say, then without a text, then it's absolutely certain that the listeners will not be able to absorb what you have to say when they're listening to it for the first time, right? So part of it, I think, is also just thinking about figuring out what the main point is, right, and focusing on that, because I forget how this was translated about some 报告 the translation of my title, the Chinese.
哦，不是，广济选的中文叫什么？如何做一个馭猫的技术？如何做一个
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think a presentation is fundamentally different from 报告, right? The object of the presentation is not to present a lot of information because there's no way people can absorb that information. The object of the presentation, I think, is to make people, inspire people to say, can I read your article on this,
Yes.
right? To make people think, oh, this is an interesting topic. I want to learn more about it, right? If you can do that, then that's, it's 非常成功, right? It's really successful. It's not to convey information. It's to basically open people's eyes to the interest of the topic.
还有朋友，先后面那边有一位，然后这边有一位，对，您对。请简单介绍一下自己哦。
And I saw your presentation last week, which was wonderful, and today was wonderful, and I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you.
So thank you for giving us a different possibility. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the implications of the presentation on your ideas of the classroom more broadly. I've done some work in innovation in prison education, so I think a lot about this. Do you think of the classroom semester as one string of presentations? Do you think of it as one global interaction with students? Does your style change with a smaller seminar? And if you could, more broadly, if you could redesign the college classroom or even the graduate classroom, what would it look like if students aren't passive, if they have experiences? In the prison context, people will have life experiences in contact with judges and parole officers. But what about any other classroom at Harvard or here? How would you totally redesign it?
Redesign it? So the first thing I'd say is that I think presentation is an art, which means that everybody has a different style, right? Ultimately, everybody has to develop their own particular style that fits both their personality and their subject, right? There are different ways. In my case, I think I think of seminars and lectures are totally different things. Because I don't lecture in seminars, right? We just have discussions. But I have to say, I think of lectures as in two ways. One, I do think about this as this idea of ichi hui, right? That every lecture I want, to the best of my ability, to be something memorable, right? And increasingly, as I've gotten older, I just try to think about, I just want students to learn one thing, right? I don't care about a lot, because my own experiences, I've forgotten so much, right? I vaguely barely remember what classes I took, much less what I was taught, right? And I think if they can remember one thing that actually remains with them, right, then I think that's great, right? So first of all, my focus, this is also true for presentations in like when I go to conferences too, that I want one point that people will remember and that people will find useful, right, and interesting. I have to say that my lecture class I treat sort of like in the same way I think of magic, which is that the way magic works is you give people the illusion of freedom and interaction, but you're always directing them in a certain direction, right? But the sense of freedom and participation, I think, is important for the learning experience, right? If you let it totally free, then, I mean, seminars are totally free. We don't know what the directions, but a lecture in which one person is the main speaker, I think the sense of participation is important, but at least I want people to go in a certain direction, right? And so I create the illusion of participation, but ultimately they're going to get to where I want them to go.
谢谢。刚刚这边前面好像有个问题，是不是？对，请。请您也简单介绍一下自己。
My name is Cherry Lan. I'm a master student of in Tsinghua University, and I'm very attaching you, Dr. Professor's PowerPoint, and I cannot help being drawn to your animation, because last week your report this animation about the one man pushing a stone, and today you have Earth and zoom into the island. That Earth is so beautiful and very, very attract our eyes. And I want to understand. I want to understand how do you make this?
Okay, sure,
And,
sure. I'm happy to share that. Unfortunately, I should have asked before. It would be nice to have a screen that I could write on. So, first, let's see if I can. So the animation that I'm sorry, your name is Cherry? Yeah, the Cherry's talking about is this animation here. So I can't take any credit for this, but I can tell you where to go. So do people notice like Giphy? So if you don't, I highly recommend it. It's just a GIF. It's a GIF. The frog that I used today is also a GIF. It's a site that has lots of free GIF files that you can use, little animations, right? I think GIFs are often very useful in presentation, and you just go and look for them, right? For the Earth animation today, it's a combination of two things. Okay, one is the Google, or what is it called? Google Earth tour function. So in Google Earth has a tour function where you can go from one place to another. That's what I use to go from one place to another. And then you combine that with Camtasia. You can use Camtasia or ScreenFlow. These are basically screen capture. So everything that appears on your screen can be recorded. Right? So I just use that to record Google Earth going from one place to another. And then you can also adjust the time. And in the original, for example, I also add music. But it's very easy. Yeah.
好，这边冠任对。
Okay, thank you for inspiring talk. I'm KJ Chen, an assistant research fellow here. And I have a question about the interactions with the audience during the Q&A. Because I always, try to herd cats properly when giving a talk. But sometimes I found it embarrassing because no or few responses from cats. So could you please tell more about how can we enhance our interactions with the audience or the cat during the Q&A? Thank you.
Sure. It's unpredictable, first of all, right? Because you don't know what your audience is going to be like. But I think a lot depends on the presentation, right? So, as I say, I highly recommend Scott McCloud's book, which gave me so much hints. But one of the things that Scott McCloud talks about in comics is the difference between pictures. If you read comics, there are pictures that are very realistic and pictures that are like Charlie Brown, very simple and schematic, right? And he argues that the essence of comics are the simple schematic pictures, and that, and the difference, he suggests, between looking at a picture that's very realistic and that one that's very simple is that when you see a very realistic picture, you see the picture of a particular individual. You see, Barack Obama or Brad Pitt or, a specific person. When you see a circle and some dots, it's your imagination that's making it into a face, right? And because it's your imagination, you have a sense of identification and participation. And for me, I think this is a very suggestive idea that, and this is particularly true, I think, for presentations as opposed to essays or articles or books, that the more detailed and realistic, the equivalent in academic presentation, it's more detailed and filled with precise detail, right? Which many academics think this is better, right? That it's more precise and detailed. But the result for the listener, I think, is that it feels, they may be impressed and think, oh, 很有学问, right? But they think, oh, it's your research. It has nothing to do with me, right? What can I say, right? I'm not an expert, right? What can I say about this? Whereas if you make it more like a comic that's sort of simpler and focusing on the idea, right? What is the takeaway, right? What is the key idea? Then there's ways in which they can, oh, this is related to my interest as well, right? So I think it's partly the intention of giving people a way of participating in their own way in that presentation, right? Because otherwise, I listen to many presentations, I have no way to, can't think of a good question because it's so outside anything I know, right? But if it's themes, right, then I can see a way in which I can latch on and ask a question. So I think part of it is really thinking about presentation in a very different way than thinking about writing an article, right? So I also think that by the way, that having a good key phrase, to use that American word, takeaway, figure out what is a key phrase, right? In Japanese you say shitokoto de ieba, right? If you were to summarize in one word or one phrase, what is it that you want people to remember? I think in thinking about that and explicitly stating that is really important, right? So, some of you were at my talk on Thursday. For me on Thursday, the talk was about the great forgetting. Today is about herding cats. Tomorrow I'm talking about blindness and see is to become blind. These are sort of concepts that I think are very relevant for the topic at hand, but also topics that people can think about, in other contexts, right?
Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy. So I was recently listening to some of your older lectures, the Reichar lectures that you did some years past. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of distraction and how it sort of motivates you or sort of intrigues you, because it seems like one of the things that you mentioned in this particular lecture is sort of managing distraction in key ways, not eliminating it, but just managing it. In your Reichar lectures, it seemed like actually there was other kinds of intellectual or analytical power that you could derive from distraction more broadly. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how that shaped your approach.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So it is true that I think for herding cats, avoiding distraction or minimizing distraction, I think is priority. Another nice word for, I think a nice word for distraction is curiosity, right? And this is why originally how I came up with cats, because they talk about curiosity killed the cat, and cats are very curious. So, the positive view of distraction, I think, is distraction is a form of attention, except it's a kind of attention that other people deem not proper attention, right? And so I think there's a lot to be said for distraction. I'm actually a very distracted person, as you probably can tell. But I would say that I mentioned this word opsimath, and I really am an opsimath. One of the things I discovered really late in life is how most of the world around us we don't perceive. And this is basically the essence of my talk tomorrow about to see is to become blind. That once you see things in a certain way, it blinds you to everything else, right? And most of the world we don't even realize what we don't know, right? And I think for me this is the fundamental discovery just in my personal life, and just realizing that. And you may have guessed I'm very also interested in magic, and my interest in magicians play precisely on that, right? It's all about what you can get people to pay attention to. And I think this is the nature of history, that we always have to combat or deal with the sense that we see the world in its entirety when in fact we see this tiny sliver all the time, right? And but it's also one of the reasons why I think humanistic work is so important, because humanists remind people, right, that there's other things to see, that we're missing all this that that's there. We just have to wake up to it. Yeah.
有没有陈嘉欣？对。
Very much, thank you for your fascinating.
嘉欣，要不要介绍一下自己？
Oh, okay. My name is Jiaxin Chen, and I'm an associate professor in the Institute of Science, Technology, and Society at National Yang-Ming Chiao Tung University. And I would like to thank you for your fascinating presentation. It's really a wonderful present. And I have a comment and a question. My comment is about because I've read something similar in the writings of a literary scholar in the Republican period, Qian Zhongshu. because he mentioned in one of his work about the etymology of educate. He said in Chinese, education is always putting something into the student's mind. But actually, if you look at the etymology of educate, it's to lead out what's in the student's mind. So I'm kind of, have this, I feel, when you talk about the metaphor of herding cats instead of the moving van metaphor, it's kind of similar to the chance talking.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important. And so that's my comment. And my question is, what do you think of the, because some speakers like to have a slide in the very end of their presentation about the take-home messages. So what do you think of the practice of offering take-home messages to the audience? Because sometimes I feel that if you expect there will be some kind of take-home messages, then you won't have to listen to the previous parts of the talk. Anyway, there's always a slide of take-home messages. All you have to do is to remember the facts and you can go home. So I wonder how you think of that. Yeah.
I think having a take-home message at the end is better than many other endings. Like, so I'm not a big fan of the last that says, thank you for your attention, or because that doesn't help anything, right? I mean, you can say thank you for your attention, that's fine, but just following up on the earlier question about the discussion period, I think having that reminder is useful because people's attentions are limited. Another thing that's, I think, useful at the end can be an image or something that would sort of prompt people to think about what they want to ask about. So it's giving them a clue to talk about something that you want to talk more about at the end. But I think just that ending with a thank you and so on is just sort of wasting an opportunity. Thank you for, I didn't know that Chen Jianchu had written about this, but I think that's a really important point. The other related point that I would make is I'm always struck by how faculty, many of my esteemed colleagues, make a distinction between students and faculty. Like they're like they give very interesting engaging talks to their students, but then their academic presentation is not so engaging, right? And I think it should be the same, right? That the faculty aren't really that different from the students, and we're all human beings, and the psychology is essentially the same. And in most contexts, I mean, there are very specialized conferences, but in most conferences, you go to the Association of Asian Studies or History of Science, only a small, tiny percentage of people actually know anything really about your field, right? So it's like talking to a general educated audience. So I think it's important not to think about, thinking because you're talking to faculty, you have to talk in a different tone. I think I personally am always delighted when people talk to me like a student, because then I can really learn something, right?
还有别的问题吗？
Okay, let me end then with Guangji. Can you take that deck there? No, you can hold it there. You can sit down. Open that box. Okay. Yeah, and take out the cards. And maybe take the first 5. No, take out 7 cards. Top 7 cards. Okay, and then look at them. Look at them. Okay, so this is a deck. Remember, we've created this cosmic event. It's a deck that's never existed in the whole history of the cosmos. And Guangji has been holding on to that deck. And actually, Guangji, could you stand up here? Here is fine, yeah. So that I can't see there. But we're all going to look at Kwangji's face. I asked Kwangji because I know he's a very honest person. Yes, you can take off your mask maybe. So he's holding 7 cards, right? 7, is that right? You're holding 7 cards, right? So look at the cards. And we're to try to guess from his face, right, what cards he's holding. Right? So the 7 cards, you can imagine a bunch of cards. Let's do a simple one. Are they mostly low cards or high cards? We look at it, so you try to not to show any, any expression, right? But, Kwangji is such an expressive, beautiful human being. Low cards or high cards? Okay, definitely mostly low cards, right? How many high cards? Maybe 1, 2 high cards. 1 high card. Very high card. So maybe 1 ace. Do you have an ace? Is there only 1? Okay, so just take out that ace. Just put it down, yeah. Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, so A, the one that says A. Is there an A there? Okay, you can just take that out. So mostly low cards. So the low cards from 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's a 2, right? Red or black? Red or black? Red, definitely. So maybe the 2 of hearts. Is there 2 of hearts? 2 of, you know what a heart is, right? Yeah. 2 of hearts. Okay. 3. So 3. Yes. Okay. 3. Black or red? Black, red, black. 3 of clubs. Okay. 3 of clubs. You know what a clubs is, right? Yeah. Then maybe 2 fours. 2 fours. Okay. 2 fours. 2 fours. Yes. Yeah. 2 fours. Is there a 4? Another 4? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we only have 2 left. So maybe a 6 and a 7? Okay, so that's it. You can all do this. I'll teach you this as a 纪念这个一起一会的 opportunity. So what I said about all of this about this is true, right? So what we did was create a cosmic opportunity. But anybody can do what I just did. You don't even need your own you can do this to anybody. Basically, the idea is very simple. In this case, I took 7 cards. Right? These 7 cards were on the top of the deck when I started. You take 3 cards, give it to one person, 4 cards, give it to the next person. And then the rest you start distributing around the room. But you make sure that there's a space between the first 2 people and the others, right? So that they can mix between each other, but they can't mix with anybody else. Right? And then when you collect the cards, you just make sure that the 7 cards end up on top. So you know exactly what the cards are. This is a case of destruction. Nobody will remember, right? How this was done. So now you know a trick that you can do with your students or with any audience.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much to Professor Kuriyama. Let me tell you why I invite Professor Kuriyama to give a talk.
It should look like this, the two arms.
In my institute, just as you just experienced, I hope we all try to give present to our colleagues when we give a presentation to enrich each other's life, just like we had when we worked together to promote the history of medicine. I think it really, if we all do this, the time we get together will be the most enriching part of our life, and then we can show the people that we are a lucky person to have a life in academics and a historian. So thank you so much to Professor Kuriyama.